Hello and welcome to the Workplace Savings and Benefits webinar looking at supporting employees through the cost of living crisis, a discussion we are holding in association with Wealth at Work. My name is Jonathan Stapleton. I'm editor of WSB. Household finances are currently coming under pressure due to the increased cost of living, and with further inflation rises in the coming months, the squeeze on finances is only set to worsen. Although it can be daunting, it's important for employees to face these issues head on and find the quickest and most effective route to getting on top of their finances during tough times. Most would benefit from having a better understanding of money, but are confused at where to start. This webinar will focus on the impact of this in the workplace and the benefits of providing support for employees during these times. It will include practical steps of how to integrate financial wellbeing programs that include financial education and guidance, through coaching to improve the financial resilience of the workforce. Joining me to discuss some of these issues is Jonathan Watts-Ley, Director at Wealth at Work. And before we begin, I'd just like to remind you this is an interactive webinar, so please do put a question to Jonathan by typing the Ask Question box on your screen. Jonathan, welcome, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. To start us off, Jonathan, I was just hoping you sort of outline what you see as the impact of the cost of living crisis in the workplace, please.
Yeah, good morning all. Well, clearly it's impacting a lot of people. I think it's impacting different people to a certain extent because, of course, everyone has their own personal inflation rate. So those that are at the lower end of the earnings curve are likely to be impacted far more purely because a big proportion of their income will be spent on things that we know are increasing in price dramatically. So things like energy, things like food. So there are clearly some that are hit much more than others, and indeed some of those people may be in more difficulty than the headline inflation rate suggests because they are at the lower end of that incomes curve, and of course that has a lot of knock-on effect. Clearly, in terms of where people can spend money, for a lot it will mean quite serious lifestyle changes in terms of what they buy, but it can also have other knock-on impacts. So, for example, in terms of servicing debt, so as money becomes tighter because it's going on the basics, then does that mean things like debt can build up to unsustainable levels because you can't service it as an individual? And of course, the cost of debt with interest rates rising, the cost of debt will also increase for some. So there's potential dangers that need to be thought about there. You also see it in other areas. So retirement is another key one. On one hand, we know there's people that are concerned about whether they can afford to retire because clearly their money needs to go a lot further. But we also know that actually since COVID, a lot of people have effectively retired earlier than they otherwise might have done. So of course that then raises questions about whether that early retirement is really sustainable now as the cost of living crisis hits. So I think there's implications as well in terms of thinking about retirement and the issues that one may need to think about. I think rainy day savings is another key area to think about. So we know that whilst a lot of people were able to save a lot more money during COVID, because of course they weren't going out to restaurants or necessarily traveling to work, so there were a lot of savers there. We know that a lot of people were unable to do that. So again, it's probably those people at the bottom end of the earnings curve that are going to be hit much harder because they haven't got that rainy day savings. In terms of the scale of it, there's a lot of data out there, a lot of research out there that people can look at. Just a couple of stats that I pulled out. So unsurprisingly, some research that was done in March by Britain Think said that 9 out of 10 people are concerned about rising prices. So probably no surprises there, but it does suggest that there's very few that aren't concerned about it. And then there was some other research done by PwC that identified 67% of people were struggling with household expenses, and rather concerningly, 64% were claiming that they were now using credit cards to pay for essentials. So some quite worrying stats there. I also dug some stuff out in terms of what impact it might have from an employment perspective, and the whole financial well-being agenda. And again, some interesting data. There's some research done by YouGov, which suggested that 80% of employees in their research said that they felt that financial well-being and the cost of living crisis would negatively impact their performance. And again, some more research from PwC, which again came up with actually, interestingly, quite a similar figure. 76% of employees that were suffering financial stress thought that they thought it impacted their productivity. So whilst we can see the bigger picture there and the impacts, there seems to be quite a lot of data out there that's fairly compelling as well.
And Jonathan, on that note, I mean, is that sort of feeding through to sort of concerns with mental health, staff absence rates, and so forth? Is there a straight line there?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it becomes a little bit hazy in terms of cause and effect, but certainly it's been known for a long time that, again, there's a lot of data out there which shows that one of the biggest reasons for absence is stress. And when you dig down into, well, actually what's caused that stress, then often the largest contributing factor is financial worries. And as that's been the case actually for a number of years through various data studies, I guess one can only conclude really that with the current cost of living crisis, that's just going to get worse.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I've got some questions coming in now. Please do remember to ask questions to Jonathan by using the Ask a Question box on your screen. I'll try and get through as many of those as possible during the course of our webinar. So the first question that's come through, Jonathan, is, given the current cost of living crisis, are you seeing numbers of people opting out of their pension scheme or throttling back? Is sort of survival coming ahead of long-term financial security?
Yeah, so I've not seen any specific data on this, but I think that it's clearly a consideration for people that are facing quite a lot of difficulty. I suspect that it means a lot of people certainly won't be increasing their pension contributions. A lot of the work that we do with our corporate clients and their employees for many years has always been around how much are you paying into your pension? Are you maximizing your match, and putting in place programs to encourage people to pay more in? I think in a lot of organizations, that is not something that they would particularly want to do right now, because of course they are concerned, and it does depend a little bit on the profile of their workforce. But clearly, if people are literally facing issues in terms of paying for essentials, then it's probably not the right time for the employer to be going out saying, hey, would you like to pay more money into your pension? So whilst I've not seen any data showing that there's actually been a reduction, I do think that probably for a period of time now, employers will be a little bit more concerned about what they should be promoting and what they shouldn't, certainly to certain profiles of their workforce.
Thank you very much indeed. How do you think employers can best provide support for employees during these times?
I think it's really about understanding the workforce for a start. So I think the segmentation of the workforce is really important. So again, part of that goes back to a certain extent about earning levels, and the point I made earlier in terms of the lower earners will have a disproportionate amount of their income going on those items that we know are going through the roof. So I think it's important to look at it through that lens. But it's also about getting people to understand how they can manage money better as well. Because even before the cost of living crisis came along, we were very aware, and again, we've done research on it in the past, where people actually do not know where their monthly income is going. And there's some pretty obvious things. So things like people paying for subscriptions, for example, that they don't use. So whether that be music or Netflix. And interestingly, people on the call today might have read about a week ago that actually subscriptions to Netflix are actually going down. That's not just in the UK, but it does demonstrate that actually people possibly have been paying for something that either they don't really need, or maybe they've got an alternative subscription, so they've been paying in theory twice what they needed to. It also comes back to things that people pretty much have to purchase. So, you know, if you are purchasing car insurance or household insurance, or you're purchasing or renewing broadband, for example, all of those things people right now really need to shop around for. And it's amazing how much those savings can be. I mean, they can run into hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So a lot of that, where does your money go? Where are you spending that money? Are you shopping around? Is very, very important. And overlay to that as well is discounts. And I know a lot of employers will offer discounts on everything from the weekly shop through to, I don't know, buying computers or other larger items. And yet we often find when we're talking to employers that the take up of those discount vouchers is very, very low. But, you know, 5% off your weekly shop actually for a lot of people is can be very meaningful. Again, if it's a relatively large percentage of your expenditure. And clearly, if you need those big one-off items, you know, the kids need a new computer for school or whatever it might be, then again, taking advantage of those discounts are very, very important.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. In fact, one of the questions coming in is just on that topic. And how important do you think it is that employers step up to provide that education to staff on being savvy and promoting those benefits like cashback and high street discounts and so forth? Should employers do more to promote those benefits?
Well, I mean, I think they should, because I think there's two things to look at here. I think there's the principle of if you put that process or that program in place, then that means that people will actually look at their monthly budgeting much more closely and therefore manage their money better. And then if you think about the knock-on effect of that, the point you made an early moment ago, Jonathan, in terms of stress and mental health and people having time off work. So if you can reduce those problems even by 10%, then that's upside effectively for the employer. But I also think there's a second point here as well, which is that with inflation running so high, there is a question around pay rises. And of course, one of the things that the employer needs to think about is, well, are they going to be given wage rises that match or indeed exceed inflation, or are they not? And I recall back when we had the financial crisis back in 2008, which was a period because of the state of the economy at that point, where employers were not giving pay rises or giving minimal pay rises. That actually there was a big surge of employers putting in place financial education programs of various sorts and various guises, because it was a way that those employers could say, well, look, we know we can't afford to give the pay rises that people want, but actually, if we can put something in place that makes money go further for them, then okay, might not be perfect, but it's better than nothing. So I do sense that we're almost going back to that kind of mindset now, and the reasons are slightly different. And the reasons now are because of this rise in inflation. But actually, if you think about, well, what might the solution be, then it could be a very similar solution in terms of, okay, we're not going to be giving those large pay rises to match inflation, but actually what we can do is help people manage their monthly budgets, as it were, much better.
Thanks, Jonathan. One of our questions is just typed a note in, sort of saying that some employers, perhaps as an alternative to higher pay rises, are making one-off payments to staff to support them with this cost of living challenge. What are your views on that, and how do you determine where to draw the line with this in respect of low earners versus the higher paid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. So the one-off payments is clear, and I've seen a few companies that are looking at this, and I think a couple have actually already implemented it or in the process of implementing it. So you can clearly see that could help people, particularly those who are really on the edge. And it might be to a certain extent, I mean, there's clearly payments coming through from the government as well to support people. So that combination could be very, very useful. But I do think it's interesting in terms of, do you pay that to everyone, or do you draw the line at a certain salary level? And I think that's quite a tricky one, because in principle, whilst I think it would be, you could certainly put an argument together as to why it should be the lower paid. Of course, it doesn't get away from the issue that you could have someone who's on an average salary or medium salary, and of course, because of their commitments in terms of mortgage payments and all the rest of it, that they're still facing the inflation of energy and all the rest of it. So actually, they're in just as difficult a position, albeit their salary or their household income is higher than somebody else. So I mean, if employers can do it, then clearly it's a good thing. But it's a much trickier, I think, in terms of where you draw that line.
Thanks so much, Jonathan, and thank you all for your questions. Do keep them coming in. I'll put as many of these to Jonathan as possible. Jonathan, you've spoken quite a bit about financial education and guidance provided by employers. What sort of issues should these cover? I mean, you talked about sort of basic budgeting. Sort of what else do you include in these sort of courses?
Yeah, I think some of it, and in fact, we've been asked by a number of our clients to put together effectively cost of living crisis interventions for their employees. So some of the things that we will talk about there is, some of the items I mentioned earlier in terms of what do you offer as an employer. If you have those discount vouchers, then do staff know about them? How do we promote those more effectively? But then there is also the other side of that coin, which is can people save money? So looking at usage within the home of certain items. So the classic ones are the tumble dryer. Or do you actually need to use that? Some of the items that, in fact, we provide a list that's come from the Energy Trust, which looks at actually how energy is used in the house and how much you are likely to be able to save over a year. So that that looks at everything from keeping your TV on standby and how much that will cost you over a year, versus using the tumble dryer 3 times a week for 40 minutes or whatever it might be. So people have a much better understanding, because there's a lot of stuff that talked about kind of switching things off in the home and all the rest of it, which is all important, but often people do not really understand actually what the difference it will make. So the difference between saving 15 quid a year, which actually probably isn't going to make that much difference at the end of the day, versus something which may save you hundreds of pounds a year. So itemizing those in far more detail, people find really, really useful.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. Just sort of coming back to another one of our questions. There's still a huge amount of stigma in workplaces about talking openly about financial struggles. Do you think the financial pressures we're seeing could exacerbate that and perhaps could cause even more strain on individuals? How do we get around this stigma issue?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is around how it gets presented. So I'll sort of take an extreme to demonstrate the point. Is clearly, if an employer goes out to staff and says, have any of you got a debt problem, then that's probably a little bit too much in people's faces, and then they're very unlikely to turn around and go, oh yes, I have actually. But what organizations can do is say, we're going to whether it be seminars or a webcast or animation or whatever the type of intervention, that they present something which is, hey, we're doing a session on how to manage debt. And often we frame this in terms of good debt and bad debt. So you think about mortgages. Well, most people will have a mortgage, and people don't, are not concerned about saying, oh, I have a mortgage, because it's a very, very usual thing for people to have. But then in that session, you can then start bringing in the other sorts of debt, which we would suggest a bad debt, or debt that you need to be very focused on. So typically that would be things like credit card debt, because clearly the interest rate's much higher. Certainly things like payday loans, but also increasingly the growth in buy now, pay later, and the implications of that, and just working through scenarios with people as to how that debt can build up and the real cost of that debt. But ultimately, that's really about saying to people, look, these are things that you should probably know to ensure that you can manage that debt in the most effective way. And it goes back to that earlier question, really, about pensions. If someone's got really expensive debt, should they be paying more money into their pension, or should they be reducing that debt? Then probably they should be reducing that debt. So in that context as well, it's really important. But as part of that intervention, as part of that session, what we will also make it very, very clear is, if people are really in a desperate situation to the point where they are not servicing debt, to the point where they're concerned, the bailiffs may be coming round at some point, then it's important that people understand that there are places they can go. So in terms of debt, charities such as Step Change and the National Debt Helpline that will actually come up with a program that will help that individual. So it's a much more subtle way, if you like, to bring everybody into the discussion around debt, because most people will have some element of debt, albeit it may all be under complete control. But it then allows that broader debate to develop and to allow people to understand where they can go if they're sat there or they're watching a webcast thinking, blimey, I'm really struggling here, and I really need someone who's going to really help me at a personal level.
Thanks, Jonathan. And on that note, sort of what methods of delivering financial education or guidance can employers deploy, and what, in your view, is most effective?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is seminar or webinar based. So before COVID, there was a lot more face to face. These days, it tends to be a lot more webinar based, but it's still live, like we're doing now. It's still interactive. People can ask questions. So that tends to be the main way to talk about a lot of the broad principles, what the employer may have in place to help employees. But increasingly, and we are seeing a lot of growth here, it's supported by one-on-one help, or financial coaching, as often referred to these days, because often people will go onto a webinar a bit like this. They will listen to the issues. They may ask some generic questions as part of that webinar, but then there will be a percentage of people, and it tends to be those people that are really struggling, that will go, you know what, I just want to have a chat with someone, a one-on-one chat with someone. So we're finding that helpline, that financial coaching, so literally a call, well, it could be over the telephone, it could be over Teams or whatever, but that is quite a growth area.
Thank you very much indeed. And in terms, you mentioned a little bit about segmentation during the discussion, especially in the personal rates of inflation and so forth. To what extent should you segment your sort of financial education and guidance?
Yeah, I mean, I think here we look at push and pull strategies. So what does the employer really want to push out there? So if as I mentioned, we have a lot of clients who said, right, we want to put in a program for cost of living crisis. So they really want to push that out. But then as part of that, what are the elements then people can then pull on? So that might be one-to-one financial coaching. So we look at those pull and pull strategies and how they might work in an organization. So that's one thing to look at. So what is the push? What is the pull? Also looking at life stages is quite important. So there's been quite a lot written actually in recent weeks about millennials, because of course that's the age group. They're in their 30s or early 40s, and those are the people that are often struggling, trying to get on the housing ladder. So again, some segmentation around that can often be useful. Segmentation also around income levels can be useful, because again, there's not a lot of point going and talking to people who are on very, very low incomes in the current environment about savings and rainy day money. Whilst it might be mentioned, that is not really the thing that they're worried about. So again, that's an important cut to make when looking at this stuff. And then there's broader life events as well. And again, this tends to be more of a pull strategy than a push strategy. So everything from I want to buy a house, what do I need to do, through to I'm getting divorced, what's the impact of that going to be on my income, as well as things like my pension. So there's a lot of ways that it can be segmented, and I would say that most organizations that we work with, no two are exactly the same, because it does depend on the profile of the workforce, and of course it does evolve over time as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We have another question coming in here, picking up on your issue of rainy day savings. The question is, are the current challenges, do you think, flagging and highlighting the bigger issue we have of individuals having very little to fall back on in terms of regular savings?
Yeah, I think that is true, and it's quite interesting to note that there are employers that are putting other savings vehicles in place now as well. I mean, clearly we have pensions, but that's really only of use once you get to retirement. Certain companies, quoted companies, may have other savings vehicles like Save As You Earn schemes, again, which can be helpful. But what we are seeing a growth in now is things like corporate ISAs. So giving employees that choice of saying, okay, well, you might be saving into your pension, but maybe you need to save into another shorter term savings vehicle, which potentially could be rainy day money, or could be saving for a life event. So, getting married or buying your first home or whatever it might be. So I think there is a move, and I think this is really part of the financial wellbeing agenda in a lot of organisations, to say that whilst there are lots of financial issues we need to look at, if we hone in on the savings one just for a moment, then actually we do need shorter term savings vehicles as well as things like pension.
Thanks, Jonathan. More questions coming in. Thank you so much for sending all your questions in. Really appreciated. Any tips, Jonathan, on getting the messages to employees right, and how to create that buzz among employees?
Yeah, so I think part of this is it's almost that what's in it for me. So again, if you take something like the weekly shop, so if you're offering those discount vouchers, which could save somebody 5%, again, doing that, looking at that one item, which of course everybody does a grocery shop. So taking an average, if you like, or just looking at the profile of your workforce, and then maybe doing a couple of scenarios and saying, oh, look, for the individual or for the family of four, use our voucher scheme, and on average over a period of a year you could save X amount of money, and then making it really, really simple to implement. So I know different organizations will have slightly different systems as to how this works, but it's almost like you click the button and you have it. So that whole idea of what's in it for me. So I'm going to show you how you're going to save £500 over the next year. So quite single-minded. And then I think in terms of, but that's very much, again, going back to push and pull strategies, that's very much a push strategy. Whereas I think for pull strategies, it needs to be often more subtle, because often it is more around debt. So it's demonstrating that support's available, but probably not being in people's face so much, because people do not like to sort of put their hand up and going, oh yeah, I'm in dire straits here.
Thanks, Jonathan. Moving on to another of our questions, are there any sort of gender factors or indeed cultural factors that you have to take into account when sort of implementing a financial guidance or support program? Are there any of these sort of factors that prevent take-up of the guidance or the support?
really, evidence suggests it kind of works the other way, in the sense that if you get employees engaged and they literally get something out of it, what they will do is tell their colleagues, and when they tell their colleagues, then their colleagues will then sign up to the webinar, or look at the webcast, whatever it might be, or phone the financial coach, whatever the intervention happens to be. So the engagement challenge is effectively creating that snowball effect. It's getting some people, it's almost getting it's the classic product cycle. It's getting the early adopters on board, the people that buy into it actually relatively easily, and then they actually become the advocates of it, and they're the ones that will talk to colleagues and say, hey, do you know what, yesterday I won on this thing, it was really brilliant because it told me XYZ. So in a way, I would say, don't get too bogged down with sort of segmenting on things that you think might be relevant, but actually may not really be that relevant, because the most powerful thing is basically being told by a colleague, hey, this is really good, you should get involved with it.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sort of a positive note here, perhaps, perhaps not. Are we heading to an autumn perfect storm with the utility price cap lifting, Christmas on the horizon, and winter weather? Is it going to get much bleaker in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're looking at, I mean, clearly we wait to see what the how much energy bills will go up, or what the cap will be. But I think we know inflation is going to be with us for a period of time now, because of other things that are going on in the world, such as the war in Ukraine. So there is going to be inflationary pressure for a while to come yet. We know the central banks are all talking about interest rates going up further, and whilst there's a delicate path to be trod with that, because of course that takes even more money off of individuals ultimately, is that I think we are in an environment where there is going to be inflation, there is there is going to be increase in interest rates, and we could get into that kind of stagflation environment, which a lot of economists are concerned about. So I think it would be realistic to say that sunlit horizons are probably not just around the corner. You know, we're probably a good 12 months away from the pain easing.
Jonathan, one of our questions is just asked, picking up on your points of interest rates increasing further. To what extent does it make sense for sort of financial education programs to promote sort of a review of mortgage deals and double checking your mortgages? Is that something that you'd commonly do in these programs?
Yeah, so this is part of that, if you like, that monthly budgeting process of saying, look at your income, look at your outgoings. When things are up for renewals, clearly that doesn't happen, you know, then it will happen in the same month, so it depends on the month. But yeah, when your mortgage deal is up for renewal, then what else is out there? When your broadband deal is up for renewal, what else is out there? When your car insurance is up for renewal, what else is out there? So because generally speaking, those things will kind of trip into the monthly budget throughout the year, it is saying people need to spend time looking at those things, because you add those up, and I mean, literally for some people, it literally can be hundreds and hundreds of pounds that they can save. And it's one of those things where one of the suggestions I often make to people is that, you know, these are things that you buy because you have to buy them, but they're not things that you have any real emotional attachment to. So do you, as long as your broadband provider gives you the service, do you really care who your broadband provider is? As long as you get your car insurance, do you really care who your car insurance provider is? Now, at the margins, people might say, oh, I get slightly better customer service from one than the other. But in the round, people are not emotionally attached to those sorts of organisations. So if they can save themselves a few £100 a year, then they should do it. So it is work, but of course you've got to spend the time. You know, the individual has to do it, and I think that's often one of the big points that we have to make in these interventions, is to say, look, we can give you the clues, we can give you the ideas, we can demonstrate on average what somebody might save, but at the end of the day, you as an individual, you have to do it, whether that's within the workplace or outside the workplace, because even if it's taking advantage of discount vouchers in the workplace, then you as the individual, you still have to do it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Perhaps sort of, what would you like to see the Chancellor or the government do to help employers with this? Is there anything they can be doing to support employers to help their staff?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a tricky one, really, because I think probably the government help needs to be probably done on a nationwide basis as opposed through the employer, because of course you do get into that debate about, well, you know, who's the company you work for? You know, you could work for I don't know, an investment bank or a consultancy where you're very, very well paid and so forth. Therefore, is it down to employers to work through those things? So I think the government needs to be the centralised kind of approach. So, for example, the help that they're given in terms of energy bills. Now, one can argue whether that's enough or not, but I think that type of approach is the right approach. I mean, again, it's a central consideration, but again, things like minimum wage and living wage. Minimum wage clearly is for the government to decide, but then the bit that where organisations do have a role to play is like, well, are they going to be paying the living wage or not? And then that does become a much more of an employer decision. Sorry, Jonathan, I can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else can.
Apologies. To what extent can these sort of financial education programs be implemented in a smaller organisation? Is this something that's open to those slightly smaller firms and businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really goes down to, I mean, it normally goes down to cost, really. So often larger organizations will want things that are highly tailored. And of course, if they're highly tailored, they reflect the benefits program, all the rest of it. Maybe there's the high degree of segmentation because it's such a large workforce. So therefore, there's the different types of implementation for different elements of the workforce. Clearly, that's more expensive because there's more that has to be designed and implemented there. At the smaller end, often organizations will say, well, you know what, we just want to put something in that's fairly generic. We'll go through the basic principles that we believe our staff will need to know and will need to understand. And so therefore there's a lot less tailoring. So clearly that's much more cost effective. So the short answer is, yeah, I mean, there is something for everyone, and it will be designed around budget ultimately.
Thanks, Jonathan. And what are the sort of metrics of success from an employer point of view? If an employer implements such a program, what should they be looking for to say they've had a success here?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So one of the things that we always try and work through with employers is, what are the objectives? What, you know, could they write down what they are trying to achieve? And of course, with different organizations, it might be different. But I guess there's macro and micro things that can be measured. So at a macro level, so let's go back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of an organization putting in place a corporate ISA, for example. So if you have interventions about saving, rainy day savings, or however it's phrased, then it's very easy to look at, well, okay, we had those interventions, how many people signed up to that corporate ISA? So you can kind of see a cause and effect there. Same with what we were saying about the discount vouchers. You know, if the current take-up rate of discount vouchers is, let's say, 5%, and then you put in a cost of living crisis program. The discount vouchers is, if you like, the cornerstone or a cornerstone of that program, and then it goes to 15%. Then again, you could probably say, well, that's cause and effect. At a more micro level, of course, we would measure all interventions as well. So if we were doing a webinar like we're doing now, and it had 20 employees on, they would be filling out an electronic form at the end of it, rating on it's actually on a 1 to 5 scale, what they thought of the content, what they thought of the person that was presenting or the financial coach. But also it would allow for them to raise other issues that they may have in a kind of qualitative way. So again, that can not only say, well, do people like the program, i.e. are they giving it 5 out of 5, or do they not like the program and then they're giving it a 1 out of 5? But it also allows for other issues to be raised that maybe the employer has never thought about because of that qualitative feedback. And of course, you get then the big picture stuff. So things like absenteeism, where financial stress can be identified as one of the main causes of that. Clearly, that's a longer term evaluation. But for most of our clients, we produce quarterly MI based on whatever objectives we've agreed upon, so they can just track it effectively and see it if you like, at a micro level, so at an individual webinar level, but also at a macro level, how things are trending and whether it's having the desired impact.
Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid we're reaching the end of our time for this webinar, but I was hoping just to sort of conclude, if you could provide me with a few sorts of key takeaways or conclusions to end our discussion today, please.
Yeah, so I think one of the key things which I've been thinking about over the last few weeks is that, and it goes back to this financial shock piece really, and how that fits in with broader financial well-being programs. Because if you look over relatively recent times, we had the financial crisis in 2008, which was a big financial shock for a lot of people, clearly negatively impacted a lot of people. We then had more recently COVID, and clearly that had a big negative impact financially for a lot of people. We've now got the cost of living crisis, which again is clearly having a big negative impact financially for a lot of people. And of course, people also have their own personal financial shocks that come up. So, for example, their partner gets made redundant, so all of a sudden the household income has gone down, and that becomes an issue in its own right, in the same way as something more generic like the cost of living crisis would have an impact. So when you think about these things, and you stand back from it, you realise that actually these financial shocks, whether national financial shocks or personal financial shocks, are actually more frequent than maybe people think. And so having a financial well-being strategy that does not consider that these things happen and one could argue are quite likely, then actually probably it's not a well-rounded financial well-being strategy. So I think that when looking at these things, it's important to look at that whole budgeting and that whole financial well-being piece in the round. So look at it in the positive sense of, encouraging people to save, encouraging people to have rainy day money, encouraging people to pay more into their pensions. But also the other side of that coin is ensuring that they understand how to manage liabilities. So how are they going to pay the bills? How are they going to service debt? So I think that very rounded approach, and then executing that through these push and pull strategies, is probably something worth considering.
Well, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for in this webinar. All that remains for me to do is thank our speaker once again, Wealth at Work Director Jonathan Watsley. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for viewing. Please do join us for our next webinar again soon. Thank you very much indeed.